I never thought that the boy I once carried on my shoulders would one day carry my suitcase out of his house and leave it on the sidewalk. But life has a way of showing you the sharp edges you never expect. My name is Abdul Rahman, though most people in the neighborhood just call me Grandpa Raymond. I had worked at the same textile mill for 43 years. I wasn't rich, but I had enough to raise my only son, Harris, after my wife passed away when he was just 12. I put him through school, helped him buy his first car, and even sold my wife's gold bangles to help him start his own small electronics shop. But then at 68, the factory shut down. Overnight, I lost my job and the only steady income I had. I had a little pension, but it was barely enough to cover rent and groceries. Harris invited me to move in with him and his wife. I thought it was an act of kindness, until I realized it was an act of convenience. I was expected to babysit their kids, cook, clean, and never complain. The first few months were tolerable. Then came the sighs, the whispers, the slammed doors. One evening, Horace stood in the living room, his arms crossed. "Baba," he said bluntly, "you've been living here for 6 months. Things are tight. You're not working anymore. And, well, maybe it's better if you find your own place." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "Son, I have nowhere else to go." He avoided my eyes. "You'll figure it out." "You always do." That night, I packed my single suitcase. My daughter-in-law didn't even look up from her phone as I dragged it to the door. Harris walked me outside and left me, there with nothing but the streetlight above and the cold air around me. For weeks, I stayed at a cheap hostel and spent my days sitting on a park bench. I had no plan, just a heart full of disappointment. That's where I met Bilal, a man about my age who sold tea from a little cart. He would bring me a steaming cup every morning and refused to take my money. One day he asked, "Why are you always here, old friend?" And for the first time, I told someone the truth. He listened quietly, then smiled. Life has strange turns. Sometimes the ones we love push us out, so that destiny can pull us toward something greater. A month later, a lawyer came to the hostel looking for me. He carried a brown envelope with my name written in neat ink. Inside was a letter from my late cousin in Canada. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but apparently he had left me something in his will. When the lawyer spoke the amount, my knees almost gave out. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. Enough to buy a small house, start a business, and live comfortably for the rest of my days. For a long moment, I sat in silence. My first thought, shamefully, was of Harris, the boy who had thrown me out like unwanted furniture. A part of me wanted to walk into his shop, lay the inheritance papers on the counter, and watch regret fill his face. But then, I remembered something my wife used to say. We don't get even. We get ahead. I decided not to tell Harris a single word. Instead, I bought a small, charming house on the edge of town. I painted the walls bright white, planted roses in the garden, and filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and chai. I gave Bilal enough money to replace his rickety cart with a proper tea shop. I started a little reading corner in the park for children who had no books at home. Every week, I'd gather them under the big banyan tree and tell them stories, some from my life, some from my imagination. People began to call me Grandpa of the Park. I had no blood family in that group, yet I felt more loved than I had in years. 6 months passed before I heard the knock. When I opened the door, there stood Harris, his face pale, his voice shaky. "Baba," he said, his eyes darting around the neat little house. I heard about the inheritance. So that's why he came. Not to ask how I was, but to see what he could get. He tried to smile. "Maybe we could talk. You know, we're still family." I looked at him for a long moment. The son I once carried through sickness, through fear, through his mother's funeral, now standing like a stranger, who had just realized the wallet he threw away was full of gold. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the living room, the air heavy. "Harris," I began, "when you asked me to leave, I was hurt. But I realized something. Family is not just who you share blood with. It's who shares bread with you when you're hungry, who gives you shelter when you're lost." He lowered his gaze. "Baba, I made a mistake." I nodded. "Yes, but the inheritance, it's not for revenge. It's for building a life where I am valued." "I don't get even, Harris. I get ahead." His eyes glistened. "Maybe with regret, maybe with greed. I didn't care to know which. Moving forward, I didn't cut Harris out of my life completely. I just kept my distance. We would meet for tea occasionally, but the relationship was no longer father and son. It was two men with a shared past and separate futures. My real joy came from the Park children. From watching Bilal's tea shop flourish, from waking up each morning knowing my roof was my own. One day, as I sat among the roses, a little girl from the park handed me a drawing she'd made. It showed me sitting under the banyan tree with children around me, a big sun in the sky. Underneath, in crooked letters, she had written, "Grandpa Raymond makes the world warm." I smiled. My son had thrown me out, but life had let me in again, into a better, kinder family than I had ever imagined. And as for Harris, he learned a lesson that day. You can throw a man out of your house, but if he has the will to rise, you can never throw him out of his destiny. Moral, sometimes, the greatest revenge is not revenge at all. It's living so well that those who doubted you have no choice but to see you thrive.